Good morning. Today we are talking about Jack Daniels. I'm going to start by introducing Jack Daniels, and then from there I am going to talk a little bit about Jack Daniels training principles listed in Chapter 2. I think it's incredibly important that you guys have a profound understanding of these training principles as to how they relate to training. If you understand these principles really well, you can never be too far off in your programming, right? So if you're always programming based on these principles, you're never really going to go wrong, right? And if you're writing your training program based on these principles, you always have some foundation to justify what you're doing. So, who is Jack Daniels? That is this gentleman right here. Jack Daniels was an athlete himself. Early on, he competed in triathlon, which was composed of pistol shooting, swimming, and running, not to be confused with the modern day triathlon, which is cycling, swimming, and running. He won 1956 Olympic silver medal, a 1960 Olympic bronze medal in the modern pentathlon. Right, that's fencing, and I forget all of the other sports, but there's a lot of sports in there. That's what this link is for. It's a description of what the modern pentathlon is. He also coached at Oklahoma City University. He coached at Cortland in New York, and he has worked at the Olympic Training Center for some time. I believe he since has retired. So, why do I give you a background on Jack Daniels? Well, Jack Daniels was fairly strong at some of the other disciplines in the triathlon, the pentathlon. He is self-admitted was very weak when it came to running, and he, if you read the text, had a running coach who didn't really know how to actually coach running. It was a fencing coach who kind of just tried to coach him at running, and pretty quickly early on, he realized that the coaching philosophy or the coaching approach of his old coach didn't really work well for him, right? So that's his basis for how he got into coaching running, right? From there, from early on, he recognized that there needed to be a more individualized approach, and that's really what Jack Daniels has created. He has created this very unique system that is centered around something called a V dot, right? So that V dot really is related to or came from problems with VO2 max. When we're prescribing exercise intensity, what are some problems with using percentage VO2 max? Because sometimes in the clinical world, we can use that. You know, train at 70% VO2 max, 80% VO2 max. You see that in research all the time. Right? So what are some problems that are associated with prescribing exercise intensity as a percentage of VO2 max? Think about that for a second. The most obvious problem should be that not everyone can test their VO2 max, right? So not everyone's going to have access to a metabolic cart. Okay, well, maybe that they end up doing a submaximal test or a test like you guys have supposed to just done, something like the beep test, which is correlated to VO2 max. Even if they can get a VO2 max score, you can't train at a percentage of VO2 max because you don't have any of that information readily available to you. You don't have the equipment, okay? So because of this is one of the reasons Jack Daniels created something called a V dot. And a V dot is essentially the velocity at which you're running at either your VO2 max or at a certain VO2 level, right? The amount of oxygen you're consuming at a certain speed. And the V dot is the speed, right? So let's say your VO2 max occurs at, I don't know, 6 minutes, 6-minute mile pace, right? So the speed is the V dot, and then eventually that V dot is turned into a score, an actual numerical number, not just a pace, right? So 6 minutes per mile is a pace. He associated that V dot pace into an actual score. He did some correlational analysis and was able to come up with this very cool chart that makes it very simple to individualize training based on the athlete's speed at specific VO2 maxes or specific oxygen consumptions. All right, so let me repeat that. VDOT is a score based on velocities at an individual's VO2 levels, right? So it's very individualized. You can use this from any race distance to determine a VDOT score. So what does that mean, right? So a VDOT score is essentially a measure of your ability. Obviously, the higher the VDOT, the better, right? You can use this at any race distance from 800 meters up to a marathon. So if somebody goes out and runs a 20-minute 5K, right? They get a VDOT score, right? If they go out and run a 2-hour or 2.5-hour marathon, they will also get a VDOT score, right? And the VDOT score is associated with that value, that race value, right? From there, once you get your VDOT, you can do all sorts of training paces because your VDOT score is correlated with training paces. And we have different types. That's why I was saying all sorts. So we have your easy pace, right? So if your race pace for a 5K is something like 6 minutes per mile, your easy pace in training, which we'll learn about in the next chapter, might be 8:30 per mile, right? And the thing is, like, I don't know off the top of my head, but once you open the textbook and you look at the chart, you can start to write exact training paces for your easy days, for your medium intensity days, which would be something like your interval days, your repetition or your race pace days. They give you the exact training paces that somebody should hit based on their own individual ability. So VDOT can be very cool and super helpful for you as a coach. So now that we have a basic understanding of why Jack Daniels is important and what he created, right, let's talk about training principles. No matter what, even when we're prescribing all of these VDOT training paces and all of those things, it has to be connected to these training principles. So we have to have that deep understanding of these principles. What you guys will see before I even get into this, many of these principles are no different than what you would have seen in advanced principles of resistance training. What you'll see is I have a separate set of slides which talks about training principles. They're very, very similar, right? Training principles of running aren't going to be very different than training principles of cycling. They're not going to be different than training principles of swimming, right? We're talking about general physiological principles. And the most basic is principle number 1, stress reaction. Everything will have some sort of stress reaction. Everyone will have some sort of reaction to every stimulus that's placed upon them. So this is akin to Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome model, or the GAS model. So what do we really mean here? We have to understand that there is some sort of stress. There's a cost, right, to going out and jogging. There is a higher cost to going out and racing, right? And we need to factor in this cost when we're putting in our programming for our training. Next principle, principle number 2, specificity. The tissues that are being stressed are the ones that are going to react. They're the ones that are going to be become stronger and adapt, right? So, he just wrote principle 2, specificity. What is this? It's essentially the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demands. If we were to connect this to our training, we would say going out and running, right? If we were to go out and run 3 days a week for 20 minutes, right, that would put a specific stress on our body. While it's still taxing our heart and our lungs and improving our heart and our lung strength, it's also improving our muscular strength and our muscular endurance in very specific ways, right? Ways that will be specific to running. Because if we trained 3 days a week for 20 minutes running, it might not necessarily improve our swimming ability because it's not specific to swimming, right? Our mitochondrial density, our capillarization within our legs is going to be developed very differently from running than it would be from something like swimming, right? So we need to make sure we train with some degree of specificity to our sport. The more competitive an athlete, more likely the more specific their training has to be. And I'll even go out and say this. If somebody is a complete beginner, right, and they go out and run a 5K, right, but then they decide they want to train on the bike. If somebody's a complete beginner, and they train on the bike 3 days a week, they're probably still going to improve their 5K running because, right, everything is such a stimulus early on, which we'll talk about later. But as they get more advanced, that stimulus has to be more specific. Okay, so we've been talking about, I use stimulus and stress interchangeably. Stimulus sounds more positive, so I use them interchangeably. So we've been talking about stress and stimulus, but there is a point where you can have too much stress. You can't simply just continue to increase training because at some point you'll become overstressed or overstimulated. And this will eventually lead to overtraining, right? All right, let's move on to the next slide. This principle, in my opinion, is probably the most important. So I highly encourage you guys to read principle number 4 in your text several times over because he gives you a lot within this one section. It's about 2.5, 3 pages. So it's the training response. By adding stress or stimulus, the body will respond, right? This response with regards to our sport is really in the form of improved fitness. Okay, so as you go out and run, you're going to become fitter. We can control certain variables. We can control certain stressors, certain stimuli. We can't control all of them. We can't control, whether or not you broke up with your girlfriend. We can't control whether or not you're extremely nervous before a midterm exam. We can't control those. But we can control the most important ones related to training, right? And those are total workload. Okay? So for a runner, we're usually talking in terms of miles per week or total minutes or hours running per week. In cycling, we usually also talk in terms of miles per week or hours per week, right? So somebody might cycle 200 miles per week, 250 miles per week. Somebody might run 40 or 50 miles per week or run 4 hours per week. And then lastly, for swimming, we usually talk in terms of total yardage per week. So 50,000 yards per week, 60,000 yards per week, or also in terms of total time. So that's what workload really is. Then we could talk in terms of intensity. For intensity, we're usually talking in terms of pace, right? So running at 6-minute mile per pace, 7-minute miles, 8-minute miles. We also might talk in terms of heart rate, right? So oftentimes you'll see people using heart rate to prescribe training, staying somewhere in between, 70 and 80% of your heart rate reserve, right? And you just wear a heart rate monitor and run at that. So we can prescribe intensity based on heart rate. The other way we can prescribe intensity for cycling is based on power, right? So you'll see this often where a coach might say, go out and cycle for 1 hour at 200 watts, 300 watts, stay between 250 and 300. So wattage, right, is a unit with which we can prescribe intensity in the form of power. Recovery. So this can be also expressed recovery from intra-workout, or it can be also between workouts, right? So we don't want to do 2, 3, 4 hard workouts in a row. There needs to be recovery between the workouts. But you could also look at that is if we're doing, let's say, 400-meter repeats on a track, right? Our recovery we also have to look at is between set recovery as well. Frequency. How many days, sessions per week are you putting in? A complete beginner that's getting new to running might only train 3 times per week, and that might be most appropriate for them. However, as you get more advanced, usually that frequency goes up. So a high-level triathlete might need to train 10, 12, 14 sessions per week. So, if we're talking 14 sessions, they might have to do a double session every single day. You'll see some high-level triathletes that might do some sort of triple session, or they might do what we would call a brick, combining 2 different modalities. So somebody might combine a swim and a run. So they might swim for 45 minutes and then immediately go into a run. That's what we would call a brick in the triathlon world. So this is where I think a lot of the important concepts from this one principle can kind of be overlooked. One thing that Jack Daniels mentions is we should really only be changing, he says 1, I went out and said 2, we should only be changing 1 to 2 of these variables on a week-to-week basis. I don't think we should be changing the total workload, the total intensity, the total recovery, and the total frequency on an every week basis, right? So you only want to change 1 to 2 of these variables per week. Incredibly important. As an endurance athlete, you want to maintain focus on mileage or total training volume, right? Like I said, swimmers might use total yardage. So you have to really focus on continuously building total mileage to an extent, right? At some point, we can't just continue to build. If you're building a training program for somebody that's running a marathon and you're writing out this program, you're hitting your VDOTs, so the paces are perfect, but your total mileage is decreasing throughout the entire training block. That's probably not appropriate for an endurance-oriented athlete. So we always want to focus on, at the very least, maintaining, but most often increasing our total training volume for endurance sports. I can't even see what's behind the slide. In order to continue to induce a training response, so in order to continue to induce a training response, the training stress has to continuously be increased. So what does that mean? These variables, workload, intensity, frequency, or recovery, one of them needs to continuously be increased to place more stress upon an individual in order to continuously elicit a training response. If you keep all of these variables the same, right, an individual will plateau and inevitably probably worsen. Right, so we have to continuously change these parameters. So if you're writing out your program, and if I see in your program you wrote out 1 week and essentially copy and pasted every single week, every single variable exactly the same, you're not following these principles, and that's something where you would probably lose points. All right, principle number 5, personal limits. This really is specificity to the individualization, and you really need to know the limits of each individual that you're working with. And this is really dependent on continuous communication between the runner and the coach, or the athlete and the coach. You have to continuously evaluate them. And again, for these projects, right, you're obviously not doing these projects, so you can't actually evaluate an athlete. But in the real world, when you're working with some every single day you need to ask them, how are we feeling today? How are we doing? And you're kind of taking quick little mental notes of how they're doing. And then if training calls for a really intense day, and for 2-3 days in a row you see that they're either feeling banged up, shins, quads, hamstrings, glutes, whatever it is, just not feeling great, or B, psychologically their motivation to train is down, especially if they're a highly motivated athlete, maybe you need to change the daily workout because they're just not ready, they're overworked. Diminishing returns, and this is just a quote from the text. The fitter you become, the less benefit you get from training harder. I think I provided an example here. So let's say somebody goes out and runs a 10K tomorrow, and they race this 10K, and their time is 55 minutes. Okay, it's not bad, right? But they did this on zero training. If they train for 15 miles per week for 4 weeks, for 4 weeks they run 15 miles per week, whatever it is, 5 days per week, 3 miles. Hypothetically, they should see an improvement, and that might be by dropping their 5K, or excuse me, their 10K at the end of the 4 weeks to 50 minutes. So they went from 55 minutes to 50 minutes, a total of a 5-minute improvement on their 10K time. Let's say they double their weekly mileage for 4 more weeks. They're probably still going to get better, but that improvement is going to be smaller. So from point 1 to point 2, they shaved 5 minutes off their 10K. From point 2 to point 3, they only shaved 3 minutes off, even though they doubled their weekly mileage. They didn't just increase it, they doubled it. This is the law of diminishing returns, the principle of diminishing returns as we get fitter. Then inevitably, let's say they double it again to 60 miles per week. They might only increase or decrease their 10K time by 1 or 2 minutes, right? And that's essentially what the law of diminishing returns is with regards to fitness. Principle number 7, accelerating setbacks. As intensity increases, the chance of an injury or a setback will increase as well, right? That's just the chance of it, right? So somebody who goes out and just jogs 2 to 3 days per week, there's less chance of some sort of acute injury, especially if they're relatively easy paced and whatnot. Now, as they increase their intensity, this could be in the form of running faster, it could be decreasing the recovery, whatever it is, right? The likelihood of injury goes up. And he put a nice graphic there where you don't want to train at either end of the spectrum too much. So you don't want everything to be super easy. You don't want everything to be super high intense all the time. Right, you want to train in that middle gray area, which you should see. I would check out that graphic under principle number 7. And then finally, principle number 8 is maintenance. This is pretty interesting, and it really applies to all forms of training, where it's much easier to maintain the level of fitness that you currently have than it was to build up. So the training required to build up to your current fitness was probably fairly arduous. To maintain your current level or close to it is much easier. The best example of this is if any of you guys worked out in a gym, everyone was super worried and paranoid once gyms closed up as COVID-19 kind of sprang up last year. And what you probably saw were a lot of like social media influencers or whatever it was just saying, and rightfully so, that you don't need that much stimulus to maintain your current fitness. Everyone was really worried. If you stayed at home and 2 to 3 days per week did some sort of like HIIT workout, whatever it was, squat jumps, lots of push-ups, and all sorts of home body workout variations, you probably maintained your fitness fairly well, even though the intensity probably wasn't as high as what it was in a commercial gym, right? So just a few last considerations at the end of this text. One is stride rate. Stride rate is incredibly important. So what is stride rate? It's how many steps you take per minute. This is both legs per minute. So if you were to count both your feet while you were running, how many would you take? A lot of research has shown that novice or beginner runners really have a much lower stride rate. If you look at advanced to elite athletes, their stride rate are all about 180 beats or steps per minute, depending on the pace. This will vary a little bit. So as your pace increases, it might go to 185, might go to 187 steps per minute, but you won't see this crazy increase. So if somebody is at their very easy pace, it might be 175 steps per minute. As they increase to race pace, it might only go up to 185 steps per minute. Okay, So what you should do in training is you really want to do drills to help reinforce this stride rate. And the easiest drill is simply just go out for a jog, look at your watch for 30 seconds, count how many right foot strikes you have, right? In a perfect world, it should be something about 45, right? Because we're looking at it for 30 seconds. 30 times 2 creates a minute. That's 45 times 2 is 90 steps on my right side, 90 steps on my left side, which would equate to that 180 steps per minute as a stride rate. I can tell you guys firsthand, having worked with people, this is especially like adults. Younger kids might naturally fall into this quick stride rate, but adults, when they pick up running at 30, 35, 40, usually their stride rate is way too slow. Right? They might take 150, 155 steps per minute. So, foot strike. I'm going to go ahead and encourage you guys, if you are discussing runners, to research this on your own. Jack Daniels talks about like more distance runners being more heel or rear foot dominant. I have always been under the impression we want to be midfoot dominant. You know, he talked heel to midfoot. I've never really seen much research other than him saying like we should be rear foot dominant. So I encourage you guys to do some research on your own as to the optimal position of foot striking. We will talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about injuries. All right, and lastly, breathing. So I'll talk practically. Oftentimes, because I was a distance runner growing up, you know, I ran cross country and track and field in the distance events pretty much from 7th grade up until like early college, and then even post college, I was still doing triathlons. People would always ask me, I don't know how to do my breathing. Like, what do I do with my breathing? And I have to say, I would tell them, like, you just don't think about it. You just go out and run. You know. Now, Jack Daniels has proposed this form of breathing he called it 2-2 breathing, where essentially you would take one breath in for every 2 strides, and then exhale for every 2 strides, 1 breath out. And this is at most of your training paces. As exercise intensity increases, most higher level athletes are going to go to either a 1-2 or a 2-1, where you breathe in and then exhale for 2 strides. Breathe in for 1 stride, exhale for 2 strides, or vice versa. I can say that I've never actually tried this. I've never recommended it, but I think it's an interesting thing to try, and we might actually do some sort of lab on this. I'm thinking about that. So that is all for Chapter 2. I will be creating another slide and Edpuzzle for Chapter 3 tomorrow. If you guys have any questions, let me know.